Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Reed Cordella, and I'll be hosting your today's session titled Creating a Customer-First Culture by Empowering Employees with Data. Really exciting. The session is part of our inaugural Momentum 2020 event, and we just really appreciate you guys joining. Obviously, since this difficult, strange, anything, whatever time, it's really cool to have people come together, yes, virtually. So we hope to have this event in person and see all of your bright and shining faces in person next year. We'd love to have you register as early as possible. We'll keep you in the loop on that. But first, I want to give a quick thank you to our sponsors, Outreach, Zoom Info, Connect and Sell, AirCall, Sapper Consultants, ScaleX, and Speckit. So please visit the sponsors page on the Momentum event website. And to learn more about these great organizations, we're happy to connect anybody and everybody, depending on what you have an interest for. Now, a few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this session and will be shared with everybody after the event. If you have any technical issues, please enter them in the chat window. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the QA window, which is different than our normal Zoom. So that can be separate, and we will be handling those questions, hopefully trying to tie them into the conversation as well. Now, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Abby Hammer. She is a Chief Customer Officer, apologies, Abby, and founding member of the rapidly growing customer engagement platform Churn, located in Washington, D.C. And her pedigree made her an obvious choice for today's session, since Abby has driven the product strategy and execution, as well as leads the customer success team over at Churn. But she's delivered product management for the entire DC area for almost 10 years, or about 10 years at this point. And she was recently featured in Washington Business Journal's 40 Under 40 for her prowess and throughout the DC metro area for that experience. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Abby Hammer.
Thanks so much, Rita. I'm really excited to be here today. Thanks for the opportunity to participate, and welcome to everybody. I'm delighted to be moderating a discussion on a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, both as a customer success person, but also as a product person who works on a customer success platform. We're going to talk about customer centricity today, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and we want to really dig into that topic and sort of take it soup to nuts. So we're going to talk about what it means to be customer-centric, some of the prerequisites for being customer-centric, how you can practically move your organization towards a customer-first culture, and also how you can measure your success as you go. I'm very, very excited to be joined today by three thoughtful customer success leaders, and they're going to share their wealth of experience and offer some really useful guidance, I know. I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a minute, but first a quick note. I want to reiterate what Reed said, and that is that the next hour is a conversation, a lot between the four of us, but we'd like you to participate as much as possible. So if you have ideas or questions, please do share them in the Q&A panel. Again, that's separate from the chat panel. I'm going to be doing my best to fold in thoughts from the audience throughout our conversation. So please do put anything you have in mind in there as we go. So without further ado, let's go ahead and meet our panelists. So panelists, I'd love each of you to share just a little bit about yourselves to set the stage on some of the thoughts you're going to be sharing today. And Gretchen, I'd love to put you in the hot seat first.
All right, thank you, Abby. Very happy to be here and on this panel with Lawrence and Jeff as well. So I'm Gretchen Lin. I'm the Vice President of Customer Experience for a company called LevelSet. We are a construction payment software, and so our mission is to empower our customers to always get what they earned, speeding up their payments, getting access to capital, reducing the risk that they have, and more importantly, improving their customer relationships. So I work closely with a lot of different orgs. So customer success is always home base for me. That's where I have the majority of my background and my knowledge. In addition to working really closely with our revenue, our growth teams, our product teams, and our engineering teams, so that we're all building what that customer experience should be. So there's a lot of stuff that we're talking about today that I'm super excited about, very relevant for the space that I'm in, and it's always great to hear how other thought leaders are tackling this in their organizations.
Absolutely. I find every time I participate in a panel, I learn as much as I contribute. So always great. Lawrence, let's shift to you and let's have you introduce yourself, please.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Abby and Reed. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm also very, very excited. So my name is Lawrence Leong. I'm the Senior Vice President in Customer Success at a company called Sugar CRM. We are a customer relationship management software company. And I guess one of the things I'll say up front, and kind of echoing what Gretchen said, I find customer success to be just a fascinating field because it's still evolving, right? It's not one of those where there's established processes that everybody does the same way. And so I find that just to be really, really refreshing. There's a lot of innovation going on. Different companies are doing it different ways. So, you know, I love these kinds of interchanges because I also learn a lot. And for anybody that's out there that's in customer success or is considering, you know, a role in that field, I would definitely say I think it's a great place to be because of all those factors.
Absolutely agree with you there, Lawrence. I was even just talking with a colleague earlier today about what the CS space looked like 5 years ago versus what it looks like now. And it makes me very excited for what it'll look like another 5 from now. And it's exciting for all of us to be in the thick of that. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive right in. So as CS has grown and matured, particularly in the last couple of years, this concept of being customer-centric and having a customer-centric culture has really taken on a huge life. And it makes sense, particularly for those of us that work in customer success. You know, our day begins and ends with the customer. So the concept of having an entire org that comes back to that is really a lovely thought for us. Now, when we were sort of prepping for this session, I brought up the idea that you know, there are a lot of different definitions about what it truly means to be customer-centric, what that means ideologically, what that means practically. So to kick off the entire discussion, I'd like to have each of you tell me, when you think about what it means to be customer-centric, what do you think about? What comes to mind? You know, specifically as you're answering, I'd love to hear about things that you think are, you know, how you can go about measuring your own maturity around whether you're customer-centric or not. So Lawrence, maybe we'll actually kick off with you on that front. So give us your definition.
Sure. So, you know, I think the first thing to think about is, you know, we always use this phrase of when the customer's buying, you know, our product, they're not buying, you know, seats of CRM. They're really buying business outcomes, right? They are buying it for some specific business outcomes. So to me, one of the key kind of principles in customer success is, do you know what those outcomes are? Or put differently, do you know how the customer defines success in their terms? And so, you know, I think that's critical to everything that we kind of do, which is keeping the context of always having the customer's definition of success in their words as a basic principle. Having said that, I'll maybe add one other thing, which is, but you know, the other flip side of that is, does customer success mean you do everything to make the customer successful at all costs? And you know, we've had a lot of discussions about those, and I would say obviously not, right? We don't want to bankrupt our company to achieve, you know, say an unreasonable goal. So I would balance that by saying, sure, you have to understand the customer's view of success, but I also think it's part of our role to be very forthright and say, frankly, you know, customer, this is how Sugar values success. And ultimately, for the partnership to work, it's got to be, you know, joint success between both parties. They have to understand what's important to us. We have to absolutely understand what's important to them. And then you have to find common ground.
I love that you made that distinction right off the bat, because, you know, when you work with customers that, you know, the customer is always right, it can be a really dangerous sentiment, because we all built a product that we expect to fulfill certain needs and provide certain benefits. And, you know, getting too far out from that mission statement is not good for us. It's not good for our customers as well. So it's important to couch everything we're going to talk about today in that, you know, in that reality. Gretchen, what would you add to, you know, when you think about customer centricity, what would you add to what Lawrence has provided?
Sure. I would say we both were overwhelmingly in agreement with the outcomes portion. So how I define it is that when you are from the top down of your organization, customer outcome obsessed. Because a lot of times people think, oh, I have delighted customers, I have happy customers, therefore they're going to keep coming back. Maybe in some spaces, but if you are actually trying to help your customers be successful at something, then you need to know what their outcomes are and if you're helping them achieve it. And so if you almost treat them as your own outcomes, that's your measurement of success. If, for us, for example, we're in the construction payment space. If our customers aren't getting paid, then that's the easy ticker for we're not there yet. Like, we're in the red, we need to get them paid. And something where I think people have false positives is that they start to create these customer facing organizations. So customer success is the very common one. Then you're going to have customer support or customer service. And so people now think we're customer centric because we have teams that are dedicated to our customers. But really, like, you should have them, yes. So don't take it with a grain of salt. You should have those teams. But if that's it, then you're not customer centric, you're customer secluded almost. You put all the people who touch your customers, care about their success and their outcomes off on an island. I used to call it like the retention island, and I'm lonely, I'm on it by myself. I need everybody to come on land with me. And so you don't want to section those groups off. It's really dangerous because then they're the only ones who are really thinking about it that way. And so when you do it from the top down at all levels of leadership and senior leadership in particular, you can't help but be obsessed with those outcomes and have it trickle in to all of the different spaces. And you even touched on it, Abby, with your space. Like, obviously you're a customer success platform and you have a customer success mindset, but you're also coming at it from a product leadership perspective. You have to have some blurred lines with this. Otherwise, it's not going to be the center of your organization and your cause.
Very, very fair points. We're going to talk a little bit later about what it means to get that cross functionality to to a customer centric culture and how it is maybe even the defining characteristic of that culture. So it's a really great point. And I love that you called out that the presence of customer facing teams does not mean you are customer centric. So if that is something, it's smoke and mirrors there. Yes, you have people who are now working with customers, but that does not mean you are customer centric. So Lawrence, from your perspective, if someone's trying to figure out, like, on a scale of, 1 to 5, how customer centric are I? In addition to the teams, which Gretchen called out, what are some other things you'd encourage people to look at as they assess their own maturity and what amount of work they may have to do in order to truly become customer centric?
Yeah, I would say, and I know we'll talk about KPIs maybe a little later, but I would say one of the indicators of maturity, or one of the things to strive towards, is do you have ways to kind of operationalize, the health of a customer, whether it's an account health score? Do you back to the discussion on outcomes, right? Are those tracked somewhere as opposed to just in people's heads? So kind of is that view of customer centricity and what it really means, is that operationalized somewhere in a dashboard? And I know that's something that, say, Churn Zero does, but right, I would view that having that and having it be operationalized is a key part of it. I think a second part, and something, Gretchen, you touched on that I'll come back to, is this idea of teams and silos. I also think a key part of this is, has your organization mapped out the customer journey? Because I think across the journey, what has to happen and who has to get involved. Again, I know we'll talk about, quote unquote, ownership of the customer a little bit later, but I think ownership depends on the phase that the customer is in their journey. So to me, that's a part of operationalizing that as well. Do you actually have a customer journey that people go through, and have you mapped out, milestones and ownership along the way? So for example, we use a journey where new customer gets onboarded, and then they go live, and then they drive user adoption, and then there's retention and expansion and advocacy. So whatever your model is, right, is that mapped out, and do you kind of operationalize those milestones along the way, and then tell the organization, these are the roles you have? Different teams will have different roles, I think, at different phases of that life cycle.
Yeah, that's a perfect flow into sort of this next topic we wanted to talk about, and that's some of the prerequisites for being customer-centric, a well-defined customer journey being one of them. I'll throw out as we get into that topic as well that a lot of times we think about customer journeys on the part of it that we as customer success professionals are responsible for. So, pen hits paper, now I'm starting a customer journey. I think part of being customer centric means that you back up before that. It begins when a customer is still a prospect and they're experienced through your marketing and your sales processes. less what we'll focus on for today, given those of us that are in the room. But I love the idea of the customer journey being a centralizing force in all of your efforts. So let's talk a little bit more about those prerequisites. I want to come to the customer journey in just a second, but actually I want to take a small step back, because what I hear from a lot of teams that are struggling to get, to get this feeling of customer first in their organization is that it first comes down to not having proper buy-in. Gretchen, you talked about that top level down, and it's like, all right, well, everybody who's in charge of our customer facing teams is really on board with the concept, but I'm struggling to get further buy-in beyond that. So Gretchen, I'm curious what you think about that. If you have recommendations for people who might be hitting those kind of barriers, how they work through those with other leaders in their organization.
Sure. I think it's very common for companies to you're either a sales org and you're led by revenue acquisition and customer acquisition, or you're more of a product technical org and you're led by what that roadmap is. And then you're going to be heavy not only in staff in those spaces, but just resources. That's where all of your budget's going. And then you've got your customers in between, and it comes this second class citizen. And so putting a priority sticker on that and saying that you are going to dedicate a budget. I said earlier that just having customer facing teams isn't success, but you do need those teams. And so sometimes step one is allocating a budget. What people typically do at the beginning is they might say it's customer success, and some of us have been there, but it's really just like VIP reactive support. You're a customer success manager, but they're really just answering tickets and reacting to any of the customer's needs. And a lot of organizations in the early stages, that's what they're going to do, and that's okay. They're starting to figure out what are the pain points in just the problem that your business solves, like what's the pain points in the market, and then what are the pain points in your product, in your services experience. And then you start to develop just the base layer of these are the needs that our customers have, these are the areas where we're getting it right, these are the areas where it's a weakness, these are our opportunities. And so even just developing like an old school SWOT analysis of where you are with your customers' outcomes and the experiences that you're getting. And then you double down on what those strengths are. You set goals for how you tackle the opportunities that you have with them. And then you really like zoom in. Let's get some next steps on where our weaknesses and threats are. And that helps you figure out, where do you need budget? Where do you need heads? Is it on the support side? Do you need actual CSMs? Do you need somebody at a seat at the executive table? Do you need to have some sort of executive level leadership that's sitting in the planning meetings and the forecasting and sitting in the board meetings and communicating not only the voice of the customer, but also making sure that they're communicating back to the customer what the company is doing for them. And so figuring out like what's what, who needs to be who. And a lot of times I think just customer centric orgs, they're always going to start with customer success and then should really blossom and grow from there. And then that's when you're going to start to see the cross-pollination. It's not wrong if you're a little siloed at first, especially if you really are a sales heavy org or a tech heavy org. You can't expect it to be harmonious at first. You have to maybe get your feet wet, figure out what the team needs to look like, what needs and dependencies do they have from the other areas, and then you go from there. And then that's when you get real fancy with, you've got your dashboards. You start looking for some type of software to track not only your active users, but what's their health, what's their NPS. Like that's when you know you're in like next level. It's level 2.
Leveled up, yeah.
Success, but at least figuring out, what staff do you need to have in place? What tools do you need to have? And then you start once you're executing, start the measurement side.
I love that you give some really clear thoughts to people who might be earlier in the process around like, don't think about the finish line. What are the incremental steps you can take to get there? Because, when you stare down the barrel of creating a customer journey, it could be pretty daunting at first. So doing some preliminary work and getting some preliminary answers and some preliminary momentum is really key to then being able to do the larger investment. So for those teams that have made it through maybe some of those preliminary steps, and now we're looking at really trying to formalize their journey and are trying to figure out who really owns this? So yeah, we all touch the customer at various points, but who really owns this? Who sort of ties us all together and keeps everybody on the same page? Lawrence, I know you were particularly passionate about customer journeys. You and I share a passion on that front. So I'm curious what advice you would give to people who are staring down the barrel of trying to really develop that journey in sophistication from end to end, and are trying to figure out who owns, for lack of a better word, that process and how it develops as well.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts there is one of the things that I think a customer journey really helps with is it forces, I think, the organization to think, outside in from the customer's perspective, right? And a lot of times with you definitely need different teams that have different roles, but I find a lot of companies, that can lead to kind of an inside out view, right? And then you get this whole issue of handoffs between teams and things like that. So I think the customer journey can really force that outside in view from the customer's perspective. I've often seen that it helps to have it be owned by a head of customer experience or a chief customer officer. To me, that feels like the right place to sit. But I think as long as the intention of it is to have that view of, let's really take the customer's view outside in, that can help a lot. And then to the point of, and then in terms of kind of who owns, so I think that's who owns the overall journey. And then I think if you do that right, you actually then define who within the different teams owns different elements of it, right? One of the questions that I hear in customer success is, who owns the customer? Is it sales? Is it an account manager? And I actually think that's a red herring question. I think that if you define your journey, different teams will own or have a more prominent role in different steps of the journey. So sales might own it, obviously, in the new acquisition side. And then as you do onboarding, maybe there's, kind of a dedicated onboarding team, depends how you're set up. And then as you go to do expansion, that's owned by an account manager. So I think instead of asking who owns the customer, it really should be who owns the customer at what stage in the life cycle, or at what maturity level is that customer.
Very, very important point. I agree with you 100%. The number of customer journeys I've seen that is a list of meetings that we want to do with the customer. That's, it's not really a customer journey, to your point. That's engagements we want to have, but it's not around why they purchased, what they need to achieve, how we get them value in a reliable, measurable, way. I'm sorry, please, Gretchen. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in something, and it sounds like we have very similar mindsets on this, Lawrence, is I always say, and at times to a fault, I'll say we're all customer success. And periodically in our all hands meetings, I'll get up and I say, like, raise your hand if you do customer success, and I'll wait. Everybody's hands are raised. And anybody who's not in this office that I'm in, I'll look, I don't see you. Because in everybody, like you're saying, everybody has a different part of the outcome that they're contributing to. And that if they fail, it really, the customer doesn't win. So if it's a bad fit and like the messaging is wrong, therefore the lead was wrong and the new customer was wrong, the onboarding gets messed up. Like there's so many things that can go wrong. And so when you say we're all customer success, we're all a part of that outcome, everybody has that buy-in. The funny part though is when we ever have like, donuts for the customer success team.
Then like, everybody.
No, we're not all customers.
Oh, when it's convenient, when there's sugar involved, then we're all customer success.
Success happy hour? Nope, not you, sales. Not sales.
I love that. I love that. I think this whole discussion lends itself sort of, the next phase we wanted to talk about was a bit about, okay, what is the path to customer centricity? So we have our journey, we have some plans, like, what does it mean to move along that path and continue to grow and expand your efforts to be customer centric? And there's one phrase that I think drives a lot of us as we think about this, and that is that we need to think like the customer and align our strategy with customer needs. And those are wonderful things to say. They sound great when you say them out loud in a panel like this. But then I find that a lot of teams struggle with what that practically means. So when we say we want to think like a customer, we want to put things in a customer's terms, when it comes to our day-to-day interactions, or also when it comes to our strategy, the journeys we develop, the engagements that we promote, those sorts of things. How do you get that thinking like a customer into practically what you do with a customer every single day? Lawrence, I'd love to start with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, one of the things I published, I'm actually going to read from this, to my team, is I put out kind of a set of behaviors that to me just show that they're doing this, right? We have our mission statement, and obviously we have our KPIs and metrics. But so some of the things I'll just rattle off on that list is, do you have a common view of their goals and success criteria? Do they think of you as a trusted advisor, right? Do they call you for, in our case, we're a CRM vendor, so do they call you for CRM guidance, not just sugar specific guidance, which is our product? Right, do they look at you as an overall kind of CRM expert? Do you coordinate and orchestrate resources within our company, right? We always describe, the customer success or the account management person is kind of the concierge. They don't necessarily do everything, but their job is to coordinate, right? So do you coordinate those? We have a couple here that say, do you know more? This is, I know, sometimes a bit of a stretch, but do you know more about their CRM project and their goals than they do? And that actually happens sometimes, right? If you're doing a good job, especially in a big account, I've had people call up, our counterparts at the customer and say, hey, I know about this other thing going on and the customer says, I didn't know about that. And to me, that's an example where you're adding value.
Sure.
This is, I think, a good one. I'll just give maybe two more. One is, there's the Henry Ford quote, right? If I gave my customers what they asked for, we would have faster horses. So the statement here is, don't just give them faster horses. Do you push them on? Why are you asking for that? And, there's a better way to do it from a best practice perspective. And then the last one I have is, again, it's a little bit of a stretch, but do you have a good enough relationship and they're enough of an advocate for us? And one of my tests is, could you call your customer on a Friday afternoon and ask them to take a reference call on Monday morning? Yes, you'd be asking them for a favor. Obviously, we don't do that to all our customers, but kind of to me, that indicates that, I've got a good enough relationship with that customer and they view me as a trusted advisor that they would say, yeah, I'll see what I could do.
I love the ideas of those guiding principles. I was actually jotting down a few of those as we went, because I love putting the idea of putting those up for our team and really having those centralizing thoughts and mantras almost in amongst the CS team. Gretchen, I think, as we think about so Lawrence gave us some great examples of what it means for CS to think like a customer. I think sometimes other teams don't have as much experience trying to think as a customer. And quite frankly, their direct communication with a customer is either much more reduced or, takes on very different forms than what we have in CS or what we might have in support when we talk to customers all the time. So thoughts you would share or advice you would share around how to get teams that are maybe a couple steps away from the customer to also come along and think like a customer?
Sure. I mean, there's all kinds of very fancy formal things that you could do, depending on, the space that you're in, how far along you are, what your customer base looks like. You could do anything from a customer advisory board and customer development work, user conferences. Like those are all, there's a lot of barriers to get there. It's a lot of heavy lifting, but something that we do at Levelset that you have to be deliberate, because you don't want it to be a bad experience for the employee and the customer. So it's work, it's love that you have to put into it, but it's valuable. There's a lot of good things that come on the other end, and it's a lower barrier. So something that we do with people from our QA testers on our programming team, our product marketers, customer marketers, even we had our director of product on there. Sometimes our CEO, even if it's downtime, I've seen him do it once, but it's so easy. It's your support chat. Like these are the things, this is your live chat. This is where we have it on our marketing site. So sometimes it's a prospect and they're engaging with our content and our resources. They have very early stage questions about a problem. And then it's other people who are in your core experience. They're in your app. And they're trying to solve a business problem using your systems, and they're going to use their words. They've got their lingo, their terminology. They could be in a really frazzled moment. You get to hear the emotion or see the emotion, and you get to help them. Like if you are truly in the business of helping your customers achieve their outcome, like what a great way to put your people on the front lines. If this is something where it's like a retail business, sure, put them out in the storefront. But this is the next best thing for software. where you put them in the chat experience. So we have a whole support chat certification that we do. A lot of our new hires, even if they're going to be maybe a senior level CSM, that they should know more of the customer lingo, but they'll never be on a chat shift. They still have that as a part of their onboarding because it lets them know what is what in a very different environment. So that's kind of a quick tactical thing that we do. And then sometimes when people, it's like, okay, we got to take your chat shift away, and they miss it. Because they love that direct tie, but it helps them think like a customer because they're thinking with the customer. They're solving those things together, sometimes big or small. So aside from all the fancy stuff that you could do, that is something that I think a lot of people could get value from using.
It's such a great idea. And I want to just underscore two things you said again. One, it's got to be deliberate. You know, sometimes we think these things are naturally going to happen. Like people are naturally going to be interested. Like it's got to be deliberate. And then I think, you know, in my experience being on the product side of things, you know, I've been on product teams that felt like they were many steps away from the customer. And then I've been on product teams where we talk to customers all the time, and you end up with a better product when you talk to customers all the time because you're just close to that experience. I want to pivot us just a little bit because a big part of what we got to think about getting to the path to customer centricity is the data that gets us there, the data that we need to collect, the data that we need to synthesize, the data that we need to share and democratize around our organization. So Lawrence, I know this has been a particular passion for you. So I'd love to get some advice from you for some of the people on the line around, you know, there's 1,000 different things you could track about your customers. How do you figure out what are the best things to get started with? What are the best KPIs that will also keep everybody focused? You know, it can be so easy to get distracted by, you know, by smaller items or here and there data points. So how do we get to a set that keeps us focused and keeps everybody's behavior headed in the right direction?
Yeah, and I definitely agree to your point. You know, I think one of the main, you know, fundamental kind of responsibilities of a customer success leader is know what the levers are that'll make a difference, right? There's so many things you could pay attention to, and it's really knowing, you know, what are the levers. And I would kind of suggest if you don't know that, which is okay, but especially if you're stepping into the role or something, you've got to kind of maybe take some time to figure that out. And I would suggest there's really two ways to look at it, or two dimensions that I would look at it. One is, not to go back to it, but you know, the customer journey, right? And I think that's important for another reason we haven't talked about yet. A lot of times the KPI that a lot of organizations use starts with some sort of retention metric, right? Whether it's retention or churn. But my view, and I think many of you that have been in this space, hopefully this will resonate, you know, retention is a trailing indicator. Right? We've all been in a situation, you call up a customer, they're not going to renew. Why? Well, it's too late now. You had to have done something 6 months ago. And so that's why I think the journey helps you to back that trailing indicator up to what are the leading indicators that are 6 or 9 months or, you know, a year ahead where you can do something about it, whether that's better onboarding or whether that helping them go live or, right, ensuring that their user adoption is where it should be. So I think there's a set of metrics there. And then there's another dimension that I would like to introduce that I don't think we've talked about yet, which is this notion of scale. And so this is for companies that have more customers, right? If you're small and you only have a small set of customers, it's probably less relevant. But for example, our company, we've got, you know, 6,000 customers worldwide, everything from IBM, which is a very, very large customer of ours, all the way down to thousands of small customers. And so obviously you can't treat all of those the same way, and you shouldn't. You're going to kill yourself doing it. So you need this notion of, you know, whether you tier customers or have segments, however you do it, you kind of have to segment customers by ARR or by, you know, growth potential or some factor. And then you have to think about different ways to manage customers in those segments. And so I almost envision, you know, when we literally have kind of a matrix that shows the customer journey, different segments, tier, you know, strategic down to volume or whatever you call it, and you handle those cells in a different way. You have a different coverage model for those, depending on kind of where you are in each of those segments.
Segmentation is the key to everything as you start to really scale. You're exactly right. You would burn out a CS team really fast trying to support 6,000 customers in the exact same way. Their needs are also very different. It's not just for our own survival. It's also their needs are very different, and the segmentation, certainly helps get to that. So follow-up question for you, Lawrence. I love the idea of, what levers do you need to pull to change the behavior? And something I get asked a lot is, okay, well, there's commonality across CS. If we're talking about CS best practices, there must be a common set of levers that you can pull. I hope you don't feel like I'm setting you up, but what would be your response to that?
I think, so for example, a lot of companies that we work with, their retention rates will vary based on segmentation, or maybe based on a product line, right? And so that's where I would kind of say you could invest a lot of money in trying to increase retention in a certain segment, but is that actually going to move the needle on the business? It might be a small segment or whatever, right? So that's kind of what I mean by knowing the levers.
Yeah.
And then the other angle that I would apply to it is this notion of you can't always, you shouldn't handle your biggest customers the same way you handle the volume space. And that's where maybe your coverage model becomes, and we actually did this at our company, where you need different people with different skills to manage the quote unquote strategic customers and with concierge service. And then, at the other end of the spectrum, instead of thinking of them as account managers, because it's impossible for someone to manage hundreds of accounts, you think of them as program managers, right? Your job is to manage a program and have, these volume accounts in this program and do things programmatically, as opposed to thinking of it on an account by account perspective. The principles are the same, right? You're still trying to drive towards the customer's view of success and help them with onboarding, but the way you do it is different, right? You might drive mass communications on user adoption at the volume level, whereas at the strategic level, we're actually sitting down with an individual customer and crafting a user adoption plan for them.
Super important. It's distinction and great advice. Thank you. So Gretchen, so let's say we've taken Lawrence's advice. We know what our levers are. We know where they're different across potentially different segments of customers. And we've even gone so far as saying, we're not just looking at our lagging indicators, our churn, our revenue retention. We figured out some of our leading indicators. Talk to me about how you can democratize those insights in an effective way. Again, it comes back to a little bit what you were talking about before. How do you get teams back to being close to the customer? So would be interested in your advice around how to keep, how you operationalize cross-functional processes and cross-functional data sharing if we want to keep these teams not only connected to the customers, but connected to the actual data around the customers as well.
And I think that the piece about segmentation is really important, because once you put customer data and metrics, whether it's revenue or usage or happiness and health, into the hands of teams who aren't interacting with it, they're going to have a lot of questions. And so if they don't understand the segmentation behind it, and if you have something from a small SMB space all the way to mid-sized enterprise and strategic, you're going to have very different use cases with how they interact, the revenue that they spend, what their growth is. And so somebody who sees the usage of a smaller company could think they're terrible. They barely log in, but based on their segment, they might be an occasional user and they're still an engaged one, and they're still going to renew. They may not have opportunities to expand their account, add more services or features, and they're still going to be a happy, engaged customer. You may also know that their lifetime value is expected to be a little bit shorter, but there are going to be more of them. And so I think it's critical when you start that data sharing to explain what it means and how somebody should understand it. And so this person is occasional, but that's okay. This person maybe took a little bit longer to go live, but because they're a strategic account and they've got all of these ERP contacts who they're trying to connect, like, they have a longer implementation timeline. This isn't a bad thing if it took a little bit longer. And so what we do is we, at the leadership level, across basically everyone from exec to team leads, on a weekly basis, we'll share basically not only unit economics and hero metrics, but we break out our data metrics, whether it's the content and growth team, revenue acquisition, retention, to our engineering, our product roadmap. And we'll present basically what we believe to be the important metrics for other members of our leadership team to see. Then you kind of have to go on repeat. You know, you do it every week, you put it in front of people. Some numbers are going to have volatility, whereas others, they're not going to have much movement in a week or even a month. And then you over explain what they are. When you bring in new classes of employees, regardless of where they sit in the organization, explain to them, you know, these are the numbers that we look at. This is why it's important. This is how we measure it. We forget sometimes that, like, we take for granted that different teams have calculations of how they get things presented. And so explain to them, this is how we measure it. These are the teams that contribute to it. And you over explain. You're constantly being the chief marketeer of what those numbers are, why they matter, and how people can also help contribute to them going up or down.
Context is so critical on those, for sure. And Lawrence, please.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just piggyback on something Gretchen said, I think some of it too, you know, back to what we said earlier, where, you know, customer success is owned across the company. I firmly believe that, but I also think it's part of our role, if we're customer success or customer experience leaders, we can establish that common vocabulary, right? I think, Gretchen, a little bit to your point, where, you know, I just did a review this morning with our head of engineering and support, and we're working through a set of technical things. But when we talk about a customer, an account, we've now established a common vocabulary, right? Here's, you know, their ARR balance, and here's when there's a couple of just very simple data points around the account that everybody kind of in the company, even if they're not in customer success, they know what those data points are and what they mean. And so right away they can kind of get, oh, okay, I know they're in this segment, I know they're at this phase of the life cycle, and got it, right? So I think just establishing that common language just helps kind of give context to everybody in the company.
And Lawrence, once you have that common language, I'm really curious how we use that common language and these data points that we now understand in context, how we use those to effectively change behavior. I see a lot of organizations that make it, let's say you're like 90% of the way to being customer centric now. You've done all this preliminary work that we're talking about. We've got your data points, but then there is still this gap between, okay, we track these numbers and we have these understandings, but how do we actually change behavior around these? What are your thoughts around effective behavior changing?
Yeah, I think some of it comes to what I think, Gretchen, you were talking about, which is, you know, kind of standing up in front of the company as a whole and saying, here's where we are on these metrics, and you know, we want to get here. And I don't just mean the trailing metrics, like, because if you put up a retention metric, you know, engineering people or even support people might not think that applies to them because they're not responsible for renewals. But if you have, you know, here's some onboarding metrics, or here's usage metrics, other things, I think it can translate to them. And then the other thing I think that's part of it is, you know, in some ways the metric itself is maybe less important than what you do with it across the company. So I'll give you another good example is, you know, NPS, right? That's another metric that I bet many of us are tracking, some sort of voice of the customer. And I think you can definitely get wrapped around, there's different ways to measure it and so forth. To me, that's less important than maybe if you're going to start NPS, one way to do it to change behavior is you put that in front of everybody and you say, yeah, here's where we're at, and we want to, you know, get to this point. So that means when you take a support call, when you product manager talks to a customer, any of your interactions, you know, we're going to look to see the impact of that drives on NPS. So I get, my point is really the metric itself in some ways is not as important as the cultural importance that you attach within your organization, or Abby, to your point, the change you're trying to drive around NPS or around that metric, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, I know I've made that point several times with my team and with other groups I've worked with as well, is like, don't let the metric drive you. You drive the metric. You know, what are you actually trying to do with the information you capture? And I think this opens up an important conversation around quantitative metrics certainly have to drive us, but there is a real space for qualitative here. And coming back to some of what you were saying, Gretchen, sometimes getting that qualitative is what will emotionally move other teams as humans trying to help other humans solve some problem. That qualitative side can really sway us and get people all pointed in the same direction. So thoughts, I know you already gave us the idea around chat, which is one great way of getting those qualitative stories out there, but other ideas you might have around those qualitative learnings and sharing them.
Sure. And something that is funny talking about NPS, something I say a lot is I hate it, because people think like I have to, and I think that people who are in, whether it's customer success or customer support or service, probably all feel the same way.
We all get a big smile when someone says it. We're like, yeah.
Right. You know, people think that it's something that you should report on, and it is a little bit of a vanity metric. If it's good, you know, if it's great, it's like, look at us. We have this amazing promoter score. And then what do you do with it? Like, if you have only happy people filling it out, that's great. It's great to report to the board. Look at how happy everybody is. I find it valuable when you get a negative score, and if you give them the opportunity to tell you why, because now they're telling you, I'm hurting here, make it better. And you have the opportunity to dive in and do something with it. So when it's bad, I think it's good, because now we know where we need to get some work done. When it's good, it's great. You can identify that's probably a referenceable customer. They're likely to renew, but you know, you don't have anything that you can really do with from there. Something that, in using data, kind of the opposite of how do you use the qualitative data, we sometimes, maybe to our fault, lead with our emotions and our gut. You know, people who, especially the front lines, you know, somebody who's in customer service or customer support, if they get a lot of tickets or phone calls or chats about something, they might think, this is broken, this is terrible, and they're gonna submit feedback, or they're gonna have a vent session about it. You might think, oh my gosh, it is broken. But then data can sometimes reveal good or bad things. And if you actually go and say, okay, let's see how many customers are actually successfully doing whatever that was, or successfully using that feature, data could support the qualitative opinions and the frustrations that the customers are communicating to the support staff, or data could support that that's actually just a small segment, and this is maybe an isolated thing that some folks, maybe we can wrap some better communication around it and make some tweaks here, or it's actually so small that like it's okay. So data can sometimes, like, support folks might be like, oh man, I really thought it was a big problem, and then the data doesn't support that. And so it's a good balance, but sometimes if you go with your gut too much and you think of it as the sky is falling down, your data could actually change that perspective, and show that this is not an area that we need to spend time focusing on improving or working towards.
Yeah, it's certainly important to have a balance between those. You can't live and die by just your quantitative, and you can't live and die just by your qualitative, for sure. We've got about 5 minutes left, and what I'd love to do to sort of round us out is, you know, when we prep for this session, I think whenever we talk about customer centricity, storytelling can be some of the best way to, you know, to share ideas. So I asked you both to think of just one short story around either developing or executing on an idea of customer centricity. And so if we can each maybe take 2 minutes to tell a quick story just that gives hopefully people something to go into the rest of their day with and chew on, that would be great. So Lawrence, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I have you know, a story that actually just kind of came to fruition, and I think it's a great example of what I think of as customer success at work. So we have a customer who was due up for renewal later this year, but late last year, you know, the account manager identified that the customer was at risk, right? And there were some problems. They hadn't really gotten their program going. They weren't effectively using, you know, our product. And so the account manager did the right thing by kind of raising that issue up and identifying it, which is back to my point on, you know, do it early enough as a leading indicator that you could do something about. And then I think kind of our mechanisms kicked in, and as an organization, we mobilized to go address that problem, spent a lot of time with the customer helping them around that particular issue. And that's where I would say our mentality at that time was, we're not selling them, we're helping them. And I tell the story where sometimes you sell by not selling and by helping, and that's what ended up happening here. We actually took them from being what we call at risk because of the fact that we were helping them through. They viewed us as a trusted advisor, and we actually, then were able to close a pretty significant transaction with them, renewed them for multiple years. They added a bunch of stuff. So kind of turn them completely around from, oh, they might not renew at all, to we actually, we're able to close more business with them. And I think what were keys to that was identifying it early, and then mobilizing to do something about it when we still could, and really kind of, being that trusted advisor.
Yeah, I'm sure transparency with that customer was also a huge part of what turned the situation around. They felt like you heard them and you cared, as opposed to, well, what's the minimum we got to do to keep you here, kind of thing.
Exactly.
That's great. I love that. Gretchen, let's hear your story.
Sure. So for us, I started this whole thing talking about our customers' outcomes, being customer outcome obsessed. And so there was a while when we were trying to find, who are our fans? Who are the people who are likely to renew? They want to spend more money with us. They're going to be referenceable customers. And we realized this was all what we wanted. Those were our outcomes, and it was all about us. And there's a lot of content out there, and even one of our advisors writes about, your customer should always be the hero in your story. It shouldn't be about you, it should be about them. A lot of marketing teams will work on this with their messaging, but it should be a part of the entire organization. And so we flipped the script. We're in the payment space. We want our people to get paid because they want to get paid. And so if it's going to be about them, then they should be the hero. And so we started this payment hero concept, where we are all working together, empowering our customers to become payment heroes. It could be at their company. If this is a small business, they could be the business owner. They want to be the hero that continues to grow their organization, especially in times like this. Keep the lights on. If they're at a big company, want them to be the hero in their job, get the promotion, get paid, be on top of all of their receivables and what their DSO is. And so we do story spotting. We actually have a channel called the Wow channel in Slack, where we share payment hero stories. We even have an icon that we use. Every morning, our CEO pumps out his Monday morning thoughts, and he shares a payment hero story, and he recognizes all the different people, whether it was on the product, services, CS side, who did something to help make that story happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it all comes back to your cause. If you're a purpose-driven organization, that employee experience is going to be what drives the customer experience, thus hitting your customer outcomes. And so the payment hero concept is what we really live and die by.
I love that. I love that. We have something similar. We call it Feel Good Fridays. We end our week with it, though I kind of like the idea of starting the week with it now that I think about it. Get us off on a good foot on a Monday morning. So we are at our time today. So I want to say a big thank you, to Exec Vision for having us all, and of course to Gretchen and Lawrence for your great advice and recommendations today. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.